I own this house down in South Georgia, near a town in the middle of nowhere called Moultrie. It's just a double-wide mobile home that's been seated on a foundation, so it qualifies as a house on the insurance. Anyway, the house itself isn't old. I lived there about 2 years before moving up to Atlanta to take a better job. While I lived there, I smoked often and always outside because I have kids. So, from my front yard, there was a large clearing across the road. It was overgrown with weeds and the like, but you could sort of tell that a house used to be there. Within weeks of my family moving in, I began to feel freaked out by being on my front porch at night. During the day, I felt absolutely normal, but there was something about the night that just didn't sit well. I considered myself a believer in the paranormal, and maybe a mild clairvoyant, so I felt like I knew that there was something. I was being watched. So many people described these sorts of events, and I convinced myself it was nothing though, and simply fixed the issue by smoking out back instead of out front at night. My mom was over one afternoon during a small family grill out, and we were walking around the front lawn, just checking out the garden. The sun was near setting, and you could barely see the light fading over the horizon when she went wide-eyed and stopped talking mid-sentence. I asked her what was wrong, and she just slowly lifted her hand and pointed in the direction of the aforementioned clearing. It was across the dirt road from my property, and I looked towards that direction as I did, and I saw a dark shadow simply go from what looked like a dog form crouching over to a full bipedal humanoid shape. This thing was 10 feet tall, I mean, huge if it were human. So, I blinked and rubbed my eyes for a second before asking my mom, "Do you see what I see?" She confirmed by nodding but was unable to make words. At this point, I'm really getting scared now. I know that I wasn't mistaken by my feelings of being watched. I tell her we need to go inside, and she agrees. So we begin to walk towards my front door slowly. At that moment, my spidey senses go off, and I turn to look back at the thing as it does what looks like charge across the dirt road towards my lawn. I panic. My mom panics. And suddenly the creature lurches back as though it ran into an invisible wall. We made it to the porch at that moment, and I have one foot in the door when my mom finally speaks and says, "Wait, it looks like it stopped." When I focus again on the thing, I notice it has no eyes, no defining form, only the dark outline of a shadow overcasting the already dark background of tall grass and the clearing with the surrounding trees. The thing charges forward again and lurches back at the edge of the lawn. Freaked out, we assume it's paranormal, and there's nothing we can do about it, so we head inside. We tell everyone in there, and of course they think we're messing with them. Eventually, everyone goes home, and then I discuss it with my wife, who tells me to stop playing around. I wouldn't go out front at night again, and shortly thereafter, we moved out to Atlanta. I knew the previous owners personally, and contacted their son, my friend, to see if they had ever experienced anything like that. They said no, but strangely, they had witnessed angels at the four corners of the lawn before. I'm not Christian, and am barely religious, more of a spiritual thing, so I go along with it since they are and listen carefully. Apparently their dad was a pastor at a church, and in doing so, prayed constantly over the land and his family. Now, be it strange or not, the fact they claim to have seen angels at the four corners of the lawn, and that I have just witnessed who knows what attempting to enter the lawn and almost being pushed back to the edge, was unsettling. The story ends anticlimactically, with me simply not going outside at night anymore, at least not to the front. We moved and tried to forget it happened. I've since rented the place out to one of the family, and I haven't heard them say anything about it, though I did request they keep an eye on their kids and not let them go across the road there. I later found out the house that used to be there had a small family that lived in it. The teenager actually went to middle school with me, but I never knew him. He ended his own life 3 years before I moved there, and the house across the street was demolished shortly thereafter. I won't ever cross the street again, and I wouldn't advise anyone else to do it either. This happened when I was 16, in high school. I'm working my first part-time job at a fast food restaurant located right off the highway, and it wasn't uncommon to get a lot of crazy customers. I arrived at work one day and was surprised to see that my schedule for the week had changed, giving me a graveyard shift on a Friday night. The thought of being at this place overnight gave me the creeps, and I thought my manager was insane for making the youngest employee take the night shift. But it wasn't a school night, and I didn't want to seem like a baby, so I accepted the shift. When the night came, it was just me and another coworker, who was a larger man and very friendly, so I felt more safe with him there. Before leaving, my manager gave me the rundown on how the night shift was supposed to go. At 11 p.m., I was to lock the doors, and we would be only taking drive-through orders. But on this particular night, one of the main doors had been broken and wouldn't lock properly. If anyone comes in, tell them they can't be in the lobby and to order through the drive-through, my manager instructed before leaving. After these words of wisdom, my manager went home to the comfort of his bed, and I started my long night. Being slightly paranoid and not used to the new shift, every noise I heard from outside made me jump. A few times, some customers came in through the unlocked door quickly and politely left after asking them to use the drive-through. When it reached about 1 a.m., I was in the back of the store organizing boxes when I heard the slam of the heavy doors closing. I ran to the front to tell whoever it was to get out, but saw no one. I walked into the lobby and looked around, but couldn't see anyone there. "Did you hear someone come in?" I asked my coworker as he also came to investigate. "Maybe they left. I'll check the bathroom to be safe," he said, as he opened the men's bathroom and quickly came back out. "No one here. You should check the girls." I agreed and opened the door to the ladies' room. At first, I didn't see anything, so I called out, "Is anyone in here?" No response. To double check, I took a few steps into the bathroom, and at this time, I was able to see some feet behind a stall. The stall door was wide open, and as I got closer, I was able to see inside. My stomach instantly sank. I caught eyes with a woman with long, tangled brown hair, crouched next to the toilet with a needle in her arm. She jumped out of surprise and ripped the needle out of her arm, squirting blood all over the floor. She raised the needle over her head and started to move towards me. I screamed as fast as I could and ran out of the bathroom, past my coworker. I ripped around just in time to see her run out the door. My heart was racing as I was scared to death, and I ended up going home right after. I quit the very next day. This is from when my parents first began living together. Katie grew up in a fairly large city, just a few hours from our village. Her mother was a nurse who occasionally brought medical supplies to the more remote areas of the state and provided vaccines for those who wanted them. Name it Aga and her family. When they were about 9 or 10, they were all friends, and Grandma Mary would sometimes leave Katie and her twin sister Gloria there overnight while she visited other villages. When they reached their teens, Katie and Aga began secretly dating, and eventually, they broke the news to their families. Grandma Mary was a devout Catholic and took it surprisingly well. Aga's parents were a bit unnerved by the whole thing. They had never really dealt with homosexuality within their tribe, and they were convinced that their ancestors would strike them down if they allowed the two girls to continue their courtship. When the community and council members voted on it, though, they all agreed that as long as Aga and her family maintained their faith and upheld the customs of their people, no harm would come to them from the union. Once they had the blessing from both women's families, they were allowed to move in together. They were barely 17 at the time, but that's how it was within our village. There were no ceremonies. They just went from living apart to living together. This represented betrothal. The house they moved into was small, and only about a half-mile away from the main house where we eventually moved. But at the time, it was Pawpaw and Moore's house. Katie and Aga swear that the shack was once a charming little cottage with a beautiful red door and matching shutters, but all I know is that it's currently a condemned structure that gives me splinters just looking at it. Aga worked with her father on most weekdays. Her older brother was a fisherman, and he had no interest in the family business, so my mother was next in line to inherit. She loved the cemetery and the funeral home because she felt that she enjoyed providing a place for closure to those who were going through the most challenging times in their lives. Sometimes she worked long hours, so Katie would spend most of her time in the town teaching, or at the house cleaning or cooking. At the time, she wasn't put off by the cemetery in her backyard. It was a peaceful place, and she never gave it a second thought. One afternoon, she was outside cleaning the windows. She had music playing from the radio inside, so she didn't hear the truck approaching on the dirt path until it was right behind her. She didn't recognize that it was one of Aga's family members' vehicles, so she immediately stopped what she was doing so that she could welcome the stranger. She was a debutante, and hospitality was very important. The man who stepped out of the truck was white, which wasn't odd. There were a few families in the valley, and even some Russians. They rarely made it to this part of the property, though. The main house was where the funeral home was, and all business was performed up there. Thinking that he may have been lost, Katie waved at the gentleman, who had to have been in his late 30s to early 40s. He was handsome, with an almost rugged look to him. Overall, he seemed very approachable. The only thing that seemed off about him was his lack of a jacket. He was only wearing a flannel shirt and blue jeans. It was 30 degrees out in our town, and in this part of the country where it can sometimes be dark all day, this was one of those times. With no sun and a substantial amount of wind, it was foolish to go outside without some sort of coat. "How can I help you?" she asked him as he meandered towards the porch. "Do you have a dog?" The guy seemed out of breath as he looked about the property as though he were looking for something. No dog," Katie told him. This stranger pointed to the wooded area on the east side of the property. "There's a dog stuck in a truck just off the path over there. Do you know whose it might be? It's brown with a black muzzle." Immediately, Katie stepped off the porch and looked towards the trees. "I have no idea. Could you not get it out of the trap?" She was and still is a sucker for animals. She has a habit of bringing home strays and injured wildlife. "To this day, I don't have any tools with me," the gentleman pointed to his trunk. "Do you have a crowbar or even a screwdriver? I can probably take the trap apart if you don't mind keeping the thing calm while I do it." It didn't occur to Katie that it would probably have been better to get someone stronger to assist him than zeroing in on a petite woman who could barely reach the top of her windows. It also didn't occur to her that the man had driven from a different part of the property and that he would have come from the other side of the house if he was coming from the woods. Well, she knew was that a dog was hurt and that she wanted to help. She ran into the house and dug through the chest where they kept all the tools that Aga's brother had given them when they moved in. She found the tools he requested, as well as some flashlights, and followed him to his truck. She had not yet been jaded by a world filled with criminals and pervs, so she didn't think twice about going off with a fellow Good Samaritan. The man drove fast, and when they got close to the edge of the forest, he drove off the path to get a shortcut that most of the hunters in the area used. He adorned on Katie, but the man didn't have a gun rack in the cab of his truck, and he was hardly dressed for a hunting trip. She glanced at the floor behind her seat, searching for a coat or some kind of jumper that he may have changed out of, but she didn't see anything of this sort. When the truck stopped, she asked him about his attire. She suggested that they go to her brother-in-law's cabin to get a coat, and he immediately refused. "My jacket is with the dog," he explained, motioning for her to follow him up the path. The poor thing looked cold, and I wanted him to be at least a little comfortable as he waited for me. This eased Katie's nerves. He's a nice guy, taking care of a dog, she thought. They walked up the path that Katie had only ever been on once or twice before as kids. They explored the woods, but they never went into this area for fear of being shot. With no daylight, they would at least be safe from hunters, but there were still other elements to worry about, like bears and foxes. The man led the way, shining the flashlight over the path to make sure they were going the right way. They walked for nearly a half hour before Katie stopped and took in the surroundings. She asked if they were getting close to the dog, and the gentleman nodded. "It's near the pass up ahead. He's sort of off the path, so keep an ear out." He turned and gave her a smile that even today she calls charming in a Ted Bundy kind of way. As though he sensed her discomfort, the guy started a little dialogue with her. "I'm Aaron, by the way. I live up by the border. You from around these parts?" Confused, Katie bit back the urge to throw a no shit at him. He had just taken her from her house. What did he think? Was she a tourist who cleaned windows for giggles? Rather than be rude, she primly hummed an affirmative while shining her flashlight right and left, looking for the dog. "Are you married?" Aaron went on, while Katie asked him what brought him to that conclusion. He reminded her that she'd mentioned a brother-in-law. "Is your husband not home?" "Wife, actually," Katie corrected. "She's down the road. She'll be home soon." She felt that it was important to add that, even though it wasn't true. Aga wasn't expected home for another few hours, actually, but she wanted to make the guy know that she might have had people looking for her soon. Aaron was quiet for a few seconds. They'd reached a rocky incline on the trail, and he seemed to be focusing on that. Once the silence began to settle, he let out a chuckle. "That's pretty hot to women at all." More grateful that he wasn't like a lot of people when they first found out about their relationship, rude and disgusted. Katie almost always found his reaction even worse. For the sake of remaining polite, she faked her laugh. "Sure, so how do you know?" He stopped walking and turned to face her. Katie really hoped that he wasn't talking about what she thought he was talking about. "How do we, screw?" He clarified with a casual shrug. Disgusted, Katie stepped back. "That's none of your business." She tried to remain calm, but the man's sudden change in attitude had her on edge. "Can we please just get the dog?" Oh yeah." Aaron looked around as though he forgot why they were there in the first place. He laughed sheepishly and shook his head. "I'm so sorry, ma'am, but there's no dog. I just brought you out here for a good time." His cavalier attitude gave Katie pause. She let his words sink in for a second, figuring that she had to have misheard. But when he began to unzip his pants, she knew that she had heard right. In Katie's retelling of the event, some small details change here and there, but one thing was always constant. In her response at that exact moment of realization, shit. She didn't give him a chance before slamming her flashlight repeatedly into his head, throat, and chest. She basically hit him as many times as she could until he fell to the ground. When she knew he was unconscious, she turned on her heel and ran back the way they came. She didn't know exactly where she was, but she figured that if she stayed on the path, she would eventually find her way. And she was right. She saw the truck at the edge of the field, right at the opening of the path. She checked the vehicle and was relieved to see that he'd left the keys in the ignition. She drove it across the field towards the main house, where she found Pawpaw, Aga, and Aga's brother Cal. The three of them were horrified when they heard her account of what had just happened, and the men immediately went into the woods to find the injured man. Meanwhile, Aga called the authorities, aka Jimmy, the town-appointed sheriff with a collection of European muskets and 3 dogs that could tear the skin off a man's bone if ordered to. Jimmy arrived as Pawpaw and Kyle were returning, with the latter pulling Aaron by the foot through the mud. He was taken to a jail, aka the concrete cell off Jimmy's house, where he remained until the police from a nearby city came to collect him and perform an official investigation. As it turns out, Aaron was a fisherman from the coast, and he visited friends in our area once or twice a year. He had tagged along with some of these friends when they were visiting Kyle at the funeral home, and at some point, it was innocently mentioned that Katie was at the house, and that she was home alone or something like that. When he found himself with some alone time, Aaron borrowed a truck and found the house and the beautiful Katie alone. As promised, they never really got an answer as to why he thought it was okay to take a woman into the woods for nefarious reasons. He was a relatively attractive guy, and he seemed normal for the most part. In the end, he got a little bit of prison time, and he was banned from our village. That was the most they could do, really, given that he actually didn't do anything to Katie. After all, he was the one who came out with most of the injuries. That's one of the rare occasions that something scary happened on our property, that didn't involve the cemetery or funeral home. But it was definitely the first time one of my mothers came face to face with the true evils of the world. My parents explore abandoned towns and mines as a hobby. When I was younger, I would get dragged along with them, but when I started college, I stopped going with them. However, in those times that I did go with them, I did encounter a lot of things that made me feel uneasy. Of course, I am and always have been a skeptic, so I always just assumed that it was the atmosphere getting to me. But there was one time that I legitimately can't explain what I saw. For context, I live in Arizona, and most of the places we explored were in the northern part of the country. There are quite a few towns in that area that are dying or have already died, and there are plenty of mines that have long since been out of operation. I can't remember where this encounter took place, but I do know my parents wanted to visit it after they saw some paranormal investigation show cover the site of this abandoned mine. My parents aren't exactly paranormal investigators, but they do like visiting and photographing creepy locations, and supposedly haunted locations usually end up having some truly haunting imagery. Getting to this mine was more trouble than any of us expected. The road was so rough that we had to park off to the side and walk a mile or two to even get there. I don't remember if we heard this from anyone in the local town or if it was mentioned in the TV show, but apparently, a few years prior, a couple of kids went exploring at the mine and went missing. It was an assumption that the kids probably fell down an open shaft as they weren't blocked off, and once I got a good look at them myself, they truly looked like bottomless pits more so than any other creepy place we have visited. I just felt so uncomfortable here. I'm not a particularly violent person, but a voice in the back of my mind kept telling me to push my stepmom down into the mine shaft. After all, she was standing right in front of them with her back turned to me while she was trying to take pictures down it. No matter how much I tried to shake off the idea, I couldn't help but feel like it was in my best interest to just push her down. Once she stepped away from the bottomless pit, the thought went away, and I felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I've heard that these kinds of morbid thoughts aren't too uncommon, especially around ledges, but a part of me feels like this was different, even though I can't say I have any proof that it was. I just had this feeling, this overwhelming hatred come over me in those moments that she stood standing in front of it, and a few seconds felt like hours. After she was done taking pictures around that area, she went to go photograph some other areas, while my father and I started walking down a path to see if there was anything of interest on the other side. While we were coming around a bend in the path, we saw someone else. It was a man who looked to be in his mid-20s. He was decked out in full mining gear, and although I'm no expert on mining attire, they definitely looked old-fashioned. He gave us a wave and walked off the path towards an empty clearing where I assumed there probably were more open shafts, although I wouldn't know because my father immediately turned to me and told us we had to leave. I've tried coming up with explanations for who this man was, but there are lots of things that didn't add up. The mine wasn't operational, so obviously there wouldn't be anyone in full mining gear walking around. I considered for a long time that it could have just been a practical joke of some kind on anyone who went there after seeing the Paranormal TV show. However, we saw no vehicles on the way up the rugged road, and we didn't visit this place right after it featured on said TV show. It must have been at least 6 months after, not to mention it's not easy to find. We literally had to hunt down locals and ask them for directions because Google wasn't helpful in telling us where to go, as the road leading to the mine was unmarked. It's been 7 years, and I still get chills whenever I think about it. I worked at a local government agency for a long time. Each summer, we would get a crop of new interns. Most were fine. Some caused issues, like when we caught 2 of them making out in the fire room. But overall, they were just normal kids from high school or college trying to get some work experience. In 2016, my department received an intern later than usual, right in the middle of summer. Warner was a bit older than the usual crowd, around my age, maybe late 20s. We initially hit it off pretty well, and although I found him sort of strange, I didn't mind since he was friendly, and we had some common interests. He was the only person in my department who was even close to my age. The interns were all teenagers, and the regular staff averaged around 60, older than my mom. I was psyched to have a peer to chat with, so occasionally I would eat lunch with Warner or stop to talk at his cubicle. His strangeness was mostly an outsized personality, a mix of over-the-top enthusiasm with a bit of social awkwardness, and I got zero bad vibes from the guy. It wasn't before long that Warner started having major performance problems at work. He would produce little to no work on most days, no show, or arrive late without informing anyone, and generally acted unprofessionally. One day, he showed up for work at 3:15 p.m. when our workday ended at 4:30. The office manager was livid and told him to go home. His behavior bothered nearly everyone in my office, but I did not supervise him, and we had plenty of slack interns in the past. While his antics were a bit of a spectacle, it wasn't a big deal to me. If you're wondering why he wasn't let go, 2 words: political favor. I found out from Warner himself that he was hired because his uncle donated to the campaign of our big boss. He wasn't going anywhere near the end of that summer. I put in my notice that I was leaving my job and relocating to a new state. Once Warner caught wind of this, he would constantly complain that it sucked I was leaving because we had barely any time to become friends. I would always laugh lightly in response and give a sympathetic "yeah." He would start to monopolize my time at work more and more, and it became disruptive to the people who sat near me. I found it slightly annoying, but I was also extremely happy to be leaving that job for reasons unrelated to Warner, and I spent my last month there not caring much about what my coworkers thought. I tolerated him lingering by my desk. One day, he caught me leaving work and offered me a ride home. I usually took the bus, and occasionally other coworkers would offer me rides home if they were going my way, so this didn't seem odd to me. I accepted and walked to his car with him. It smelled awful and was full of garbage. He hastily cleared off the passenger seat and apologized. We got on our way, but once we were on the main road, he started begging me to stop and get dinner with him. I laughed and said he didn't need to ask me that insistently, and said that we could stop at a diner on the way. We had a nice meal with pleasant conversation. He was intelligent and had a variety of interests. Our political positions aligned, and we shared disdain for our cranky old co-workers. I had a good time. I expressed he didn't need to drive me all the way home now that it was late, but he kept insisting, so I relented. As I directed him towards my house, he started in again with the whining about how our developing friendship was cut short because of my move. At this point, I was tired of hearing this. The decision to leave my job and move away from home was extremely difficult to make, and I was proud of how bold I was being. I stopped responding, and his whining faded out. We came up to the turn to get onto my street, and when I pointed it out, he accelerated and drove right past it, laughing. I laughed, thinking he was joking around when I began giving instructions about how to turn around and get back. He began begging me to keep hanging out with him because he was lonely. This immediately sent me on high alert. It suddenly hit me that I'm in a man's car, someone I don't know that well, who doesn't exercise proper behavioral work, which is the only context I know him, and now he's displaying weird behavior outside of work as well. My instinct was not to insist I'd be let out of his car. I felt as if this would escalate, and it could become something bad, and in hindsight, it may have been the right thing to do when I think about the type of person he turned out to be. I told him we could hang out at the park near my house if he wanted to talk, and he seemed to like the idea. We parked and walked over. The pleasant conversations resumed, and beside the weird clinginess, he was perfectly fine to talk to until he dumped his entire life story on me, including his prior arrests for theft, his heroin addiction, and related struggles with depression. I tried to be sympathetic, but I was very put off by this. It was a lot of highly personal information all at once, and I was still on high alert because of his prior behavior. I tried changing the subject by showing him pics of my dog. I scrolled one pic too far, and the next one was a photo of me wearing makeup and posing cutely, which is way different than the slob I was at work. He grabbed the phone and went, "Wow, you're very photogenic." I felt awkward and didn't say anything. There was a long silence. Then he launched forward into a weird tangent about how compatible we are, and that we have similar interests, etc., etc., and that he wishes I wasn't moving so that we could try hanging out again, but on a date. I didn't say anything, and he broke the silence with, "Sorry, I'm saying all this stuff. I'm actually really high right now. That's why I know where Riverside, the neighborhood that had previously come up in conversation, is. I went there to buy, otherwise I wouldn't have said it all. I'm sorry." Internally, I freaked out. He had definitely put his addiction in the past tense, and I assumed it was something he was recovering from, not currently using. I also realized I had been in a car he was operating while under the influence. I don't know anything about heroin, so I was clueless, and I felt very, very stupid. He immediately started whining and begging me not to judge or hate him, and kept saying over and over again how nice I am, and how understanding I am, that I am pretty and smart, all these weird compliments interspersed with talking down about himself. I don't know what to do, so I smiled reassuringly and told him not to worry. But then I was tired and wanted to go home, and that's when he began crying. He had this weird wheezy sob with no tears. I sat there silently while he did this, trying to come up with some sort of graceful escape plan. My patience was wearing thin, and my anxiety was through the roof. It's a weird feeling to be annoyed and panicky at the same time. I stood up and apologized, said the park was close to my house so that I'd walk, and began to leave. When I remembered I had left my things in his car, trying a new approach, I casually mentioned that I forgot my stuff in his car, and joked that if he wanted my dirty lunch containers, he could keep them. He ceased his bizarre crying, stood up, ran over to his car to unlock it, and I grabbed my stuff out of his back seat. His demeanor changed drastically as he calmly apologized for making things weird and asked if he could drop me off at home so that I didn't have to walk alone at night. I said yes, but made him drop me off a block over my little side street so that he wouldn't know which house was mine. I could end it there, but what bothered me the most about this guy happened after this encounter. A week or two after that weird evening, at the end of August by this point, I had my last day on the job, then moved 1,000 miles across the country. Warner would sometimes text me long ramblings detailing his feelings about himself and about our missed opportunity. I didn't respond to these messages. Now that I wasn't near him, I didn't feel the need to say anything. The texts stopped after a few weeks, and I forgot about him. Fast forward to February, and I get a text from a former coworker. Her message said, "Sorry you had to hear about it this way." And her next message was a link to a local news article titled, "Man dies from wounds in Riverside stabbing Wednesday." Because of the way she worded it, I thought Warner was the victim. But when I read the article, it included his mugshot and the charges. He was the attacker. He murdered someone. I felt so shocked and disgusted. I couldn't believe I knew someone who killed another human. Later on, I called an old work friend for some details. Apparently, shortly after I left the job, he was fired for trashing the men's bathroom. Like just threw around anything he could lift and poured all the soap out and smeared it all over the place. He then lost his apartment. Presumably, some of the articles about the stabbing described Warner as a homeless man. I have to assume that's how he ended up in the aforementioned Riverside. There are lots of homeless drug addicts who squat in abandoned houses. I wondered if the man he stabbed had refused to give him something that he wanted, and that's how he reacted to a hard no. I don't think I made all the wisest decisions during my interactions with Warner, but I'm glad I was able to avoid setting him off since he was clearly not stable. Hands down, the worst intern I've ever encountered. And now, I can't shake off the feeling of relief that I left that job and moved far away from him. It's a terrifying thought to realize that I was in a car with someone capable of such violence. I'll always remember this experience as a chilling reminder to be cautious and trust my instincts when dealing with people whose behavior raises red flags. In the aftermath of learning about Warner's violent act, I couldn't help but think about the close call I had with him. It made me reflect on how important it is to trust our gut instincts when dealing with people, especially those who display erratic behavior or make us feel uncomfortable. Looking back, there were several warning signs that I chose to overlook or downplay, and I vowed to be more vigilant in the future. My move to the new state provided a fresh start, and I was grateful to leave behind the unsettling memories of my encounter with Warner. I focused on my new job, made new friends, and gradually built a life in my new surroundings. Despite everything, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered after learning about Warner's actions. I couldn't help but wonder if there was more to his story that I didn't know or understand. It was a sobering reminder that people we encounter in our lives can be harboring dark secrets and unpredictable tendencies. Over time, I found comfort in sharing my experience with friends and family. Talking about it helped me process the lingering emotions and fears, and it also reinforced the importance of being cautious and aware of potential dangers in any situation. As I moved forward in my life, I tried to focus on the positive aspects and the lessons learned. I learned to be more assertive about setting boundaries with people who make me uncomfortable, both in personal and professional settings. I also learned to trust my instincts more and not be swayed by external pressures or social expectations. Every now and then, I would check in on the news and find updates about Warner's case. He was eventually arrested and charged, and justice was served for his victim and their family. It was a relief to know that he was off the streets and could no longer pose a threat to others. Time passed, and the memory of that unsettling encounter gradually faded into the background of my life. I continued to grow, learn, and adapt to the challenges and joys that life presented. In the end, this experience became a pivotal moment in my life, teaching me valuable lessons about self-preservation, trust, and the complexities of human behavior. It also reinforced the importance of empathy and compassion, as we never truly know the battles others are fighting. While I have encountered challenging situations and individuals in my life since then, my encounter with Warner remains a haunting reminder of the darker side of human nature. It has made me more vigilant and cautious, but has also served as a reminder to appreciate the goodness and kindness that exist in the world. Life is unpredictable, and we cannot always control the circumstances or the people we encounter. But we can learn from our experiences, grow stronger, and move forward with greater wisdom and resilience. I carry this knowledge with me as I continue to navigate the twists and turns of life, forever grateful for the lessons learned from that fateful summer with the worst intern I ever encountered. Hey there, hope you enjoyed these stories. If you can, please like and subscribe. I would appreciate it. See you next time.